Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us here at the Atlantic Council for Veterans Advanced Energy Week from wherever you happen to be from. It's been a good day so far. We've had a discussion already about energy efficiency. If you were unable to listen in on that, you can join us on the conference app at the Atlantic Council. We also have a YouTube channel that will have that stored for you. My name's Tom Morehouse. I'm a senior advisor at the Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'm also a former acting assistant secretary of defense for operational energy plans and programs. I'm also a retired Air Force guy, so a fellow vet. So it was nice of you all to join us today. Before I get started, I got a couple of housekeeping things I'd like to bring up. First of all, we are on the record and we are live streaming currently on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about what you hear today and share on social media using hashtag Vets in Energy, one word, and tagging us at AC Global Energy and Vets and underscore energy. If you'd like to participate in the conversation, please submit your questions to the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your screen anytime during the event, and we'll incorporate them as we can. However, only those directly engaged via the Veterans Energy app will be able to submit questions. I'll be your moderator for this session, and I'm pleased to be joined today by an esteemed panel of experts, and we'll discuss the future of the electric grid. Over the past 15 years or so, the grid has undergone massive changes, and the pace is not slowing down at all. In fact, over the next decade, you're likely to see more change in the grid than we've seen in the past century. On the generation side, renewables and natural gas are up. Coal and greenhouse gas emissions are down. In fact, there's been virtually no appreciable coal put on the grid in the past since 2014. Environmental policy is not driving this. It's economics. Utility scale renewables like solar and wind are now cheaper on average than any other type of energy, and that's without subsidies. That's straight up cost, levelized cost of electricity. The problem with renewables is that they don't make electricity when you need it. They make electricity when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing. Natural gas has also gone down quite a bit in price, and you've seen a lot of expansion of that, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later on. But this is where things get complicated because the renewables are intermittent, and the grid is very much on-time delivery. You have to use what you make. It has to go somewhere. Storage is expensive, and managing this dance it takes a lot of intelligent controls. And when you put intelligent controls in place, you create a threat surface for nefarious cyber actors. So it's one of the sets of vulnerabilities that we create when we do this. And of course, with global warming, we're going to experience more frequent and more severe extreme weather events, and the grid is also vulnerable to outages for that reason as well. In fact, in 2019, there were 47 large-scale power outages, and a large scale is those with more than 50,000 customers affected for more than an hour. And only one of these was not caused by a severe weather event, so all of the rest were because of weather. The good news is that the energy sector is decarbonizing and becoming more flexible and efficient. The bad news is there's no free lunch, and there are these complications that come along with the evolution of the grid, and we have our experts here to talk about this today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. I will introduce him by title and company, and then I will let the speakers take it away with the question I will ask of them. So our first speaker is Brock Forrest. Brock is a chief engineer at a company called NetPower, and I'll let her explain what that is. So Brock, since your La Porte demonstration and testing facility opened in 2018, you've secured plans to build a commercial scale 300 megawatt plant at a site that's to be determined. And you've launched a number of projects around the world for rapid deployment. The technology that you're going to talk about seems to have a lot of potential to further mitigate carbon emissions from the electricity sector worldwide. So I was wondering if you could share with us the vision that your company has of the impact that they're going to have over coming decade on carbon emissions. And can you also identify for us any use cases for which your technology is not well suited? Because it seems like it could probably work pretty much anywhere.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, happy to answer that question. So right now, NetPower has publicly revealed 3 locations: one in New Zealand, one in Louisiana, and one in the UK, where we're developing assets. In Louisiana, we look to deploy 4 power plants that actually be running to create a zero carbon LNG export facility, and that's part of the G2 LNG. In the UK, we're looking to develop a plant that would be exporting CO2 to the North Sea for sequestration, in consortium and support from the UK government, base, for those of you who are familiar with them. And in New Zealand, it's a fertilizer facility that's looking to have zero carbon footprint associated with the power, as well as combined heat and power from NetPower for production of urea for New Zealand, Australasia as a whole. So those are the public announcements. There's several more on the frontier. As far as what we see as our vision, the point is we want to make, clean cheaper than dirty. We see low-cost natural gas as an asset, and one of the ways we think we can use that is by implementing NetPower facilities across the world in a way where we want to target 2-cent kilowatt-hour power, $5 to $10 a kilowatt-hour storage through oxygen storage with the air separation units associated with their oxy-fuel combustion, full dispatchability, as well as pipeline-ready carbon capture. So what you're talking about is a power asset that completely supports renewables, provides storage and backup, and doesn't raise the cost of electricity on our most vulnerable members of society. Where can't this be deployed? The hard answer there is going to be places that generally don't have access for easy CO2 offtake. But when you're capturing carbon dioxide in our plant at $2 to $5 a ton, that becomes financially viable to start looking at things like sequestration wells in saline aquifers, and much of the, we'll say, polluting world where carbon emissions are coming from do have access to these types of subsurface geologies. So I think NetPower sees itself as the solution for pairing with renewables while not increasing cost of power for the most vulnerable members of society.
Thank you. If I could just ask you to elaborate just a little bit more on what is it about your process that differentiates you from a traditional natural gas power plant, because I'm not sure that people understand that.
Yeah, okay. So the is radically different. What we are is a CO2 power cycle where we use oxy-fuel combustion. So oxygen, pure oxygen, methane, and a stream of CO2 come into a combustor. We expand through a turbine to generate electricity. The only byproducts out of that process end up being water, which can be separated out as a liquid, and CO2, which is controlled as a pressurized vapor, which can then be sequestered. So in our plant, we operate at pressures that are already completely compatible with CCS and CCUS reservoirs and usage. So we are a brand new type of power cycle, thermodynamic cycle, that a conventional gas plant is not compatible with.
Okay. Thank you, Brock. Our next speaker is Jason Meidinger. Jason is the director of generation projects, offshore wind programs for Dominion Energy, which is our provider here in Virginia. So Jason, I have a question that I'd like to put to you. Dominion's proposed the largest wind development project in the country, 2.6 gigawatts by 2026, involving 220 turbines at a cost of almost $8 billion. And this is the first ever wind program in the country that's built in federal waters. The first 2 pilot turbines were 6 megawatts each, and they went into operation in June, so you have some experience from those already. As you work towards these goals, and based on your load projections, how do you see this project affecting Dominion's power mix between now and 2050? And as a companion question, and one that may be of interest to our audience, is if I'm a veteran and I want to get into the energy business, and you're a utility, so you hire lots of folks, what advice would you give to vets about what kind of marketable skills should they be looking to develop if they want jobs in the utility sector?
And first of all, thank you, Tom. I'm really excited to be here. That was a lot of questions. I'll try to address them all. So the first, concerning the turbines that we just built, I mean, we're very proud that we finished this. These turbines are actually mechanically functioning. We're going through our final kind of regulatory requirements to get them operating for the grid, but we're treating this as like a catalyst for this large commercial project we have coming up. We're using these pilot programs or the pilot turbines to really have lessons learned to help us develop this 2.6 gigawatt farm. To answer your question about how this is affecting Dominion Energy's future mix, it's a dramatic shift. We are going to be investing in renewable energy significantly in the next 15 years. We have plans to bring on about 24 gigawatts of power in the next 15 years, and we're talking 5 gigawatts of offshore wind, almost 16 gigawatts of solar, and if we, as technology evolves, we're looking at almost 2.7 to 3 gigawatts of energy storage. So it's an exciting time to be in this field. There's a lot of technical challenges that come with that, as you were talking about earlier. The wind's not always blowing, the sun's not always shining, and how do we maintain that reliability for our customers is a unique challenge, and there's going to be lots of opportunities for technical experts, trades, to help promote green energy in the near future. To answer your second question of how to, as veterans, to make that transition, I think the most important thing is for veterans to promote themselves. They should need to be their own advocates. Spend time on developing yourself, use the GI Bill, look towards companies that focused on veteran employment. Dominion Energy is great with that because we have 1 out of 5 employees is typically, as we hire them, as a veteran. So there's lots of opportunities out there. Look for them and invest in yourself so that you can promote yourself and get your foot in the door for these good jobs that are coming up.
Okay. Thank you. Our next panelist is Jeff Danielson, and Jeff is also in the wind business, and I put him to follow the utility. Jeff is with the trade association. He's with the American Wind Energy Association. And my question to Jeff is, wind energy has had its share of obstacles over the years. You know, despite the fact that wind energy is the largest growing renewable energy at this point in time, but there have been a lot of issues around things like bird strikes, lightning strikes, failures from high windstorms, cyber events, radar interference, and logistical issues around moving extremely huge structures. Then you've had social pushback because some people don't like the idea of these big rotating machines spoiling their vistas. They don't like the noise. And then, of course, there's the challenges associated with intermittency and the ability to move electrons from where the wind resources are good to where the electrons are actually needed. So my question for you is, can you highlight for us what you see as the most significant barriers to the industry going forward? And if you were king for a day, what would you do to fix them?
So we live in a democracy, Tom. I'd rather be president than a king, but your point is well taken. So you gave a list of pretty tremendous obstacles or challenges. Our industry sees those as an opportunity to innovate and problem solve. And so despite those obstacles, wind is now the cheapest, safest, healthiest new electricity on the grid. We surpassed hydro last year for the largest renewable energy source on America's grid. And we've also brought down the costs over the last decade or two, nearly 70%. So some of that might be because the wind energy industry, like me, is a Navy veteran. We hire veterans at nearly 2/3 higher rate than the average labor market in the United States. So we're hiring nearly double what others are in terms of veterans looking for work. I'm an example of that. And so what are the things that we think need to be fixed going forward, or the challenges that we face? One of them is our electricity system, the grid, if you will, is incredibly fragmented, sometimes regional, sometimes state-based. We've never really had an Eisenhower moment. When President Eisenhower proposed the interstate highway system in the 1950s, what he really wanted to do was connect our economies and through the automobile and transportation. We've never really thought about that as a country in terms of our electricity system. And there are ways in which you can do it that are not heavy-handed and overreach. You can actually work with states and local communities and our regional transmission organizations to do that. The other challenge we face is institutional. People like things the way they are. It's not easy to get bureaucracies to move and be innovative. And so we at AWEA, the American Wind Energy Association, try to help them with ideas about how to integrate these new technologies. The challenge is not necessarily technical. We have a lot of innovative ideas. The challenge is actually adopting them as people are innovating and ready to commercialize them and getting those institutions to build that into their planning process. Finally, we think that tax policy that should be fair and create incentives for growth and innovation. We're going to have tremendous opportunities post-COVID to juice our economy in new and different ways. We think one of the best ways you can do that is through the electricity sector and making sure that all of these systems work together better in the future and more two-way in terms of information and management of those resources instead of the one-way sort of grid that we have today.
Okay, thank you. Next question I'd like to ask to Jim Niemiec. Jim is the Vice President of Operations Services for Southern California Edison Electric. And Southern California Edison Electric has come up with a program they call Pathway 2045. It's a fairly comprehensive portfolio approach to achieving carbon neutrality in 25 years through decarbonization of the electric sector, through renewables and storage, through grid modernization to enable high penetration of renewables, electrification of transportation, electric cars and so forth, low carbon fuels for hard to electrify end uses like transportation, and advanced energy efficiency, and then carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is something that our first panel spoke about as well. You know, obstacles abound in all of these areas: technical, economic, policy, public acceptance. So I'd like to ask Jim, what do you see as the most significant obstacle for Southern California Electric to overcome in order to achieve this fairly ambitious goal of carbon neutrality by 2045?
Oh, great question, Tom. Appreciate also the opportunity to be with all of you today. Like several of you, like many of you in the audience, I'm also a veteran. Did my college at West Point and was really happy to join this industry about a year ago, mainly because of its friendliness to veterans. So in case any of you have questions around what is it like for a veteran to break into this industry, even mid-career, I'd be happy to share some thoughts on that offline. To your question, Tom, you know, Edison's in a really unique position here in California. First of all, California is in a really unique position to lead in this space. And to brag a little bit, I actually, an external viewpoint would say we are leading in this space, partly because we've laid out Pathway 2045. You did a nice job highlighting some of its key tenets, but I'll probably resonate along that. I'll pick one. One is trying to figure out how we electrify more of what we do in California and how we consume energy. A big piece of that, and you have to look no further than those famous shots of the Los Angeles freeways, is transportation. And not only electrifying the vehicles that our customers use, but frankly, walking the talk and electrifying our own assets that we use to deploy our workers and our contractors to keep the grid that we do run maintained. So for example, since I've arrived at Edison a year ago, we've launched a Walk the Talk initiative on sustainability that is closely tied to the goals that we've articulated in our Pathway 2045 position paper and our work with the state government and the California Public Utilities Commission to collaboratively do that work. But we kind of realized if we're going to be advertising to our commercial customers how they should be electrifying their fleet, particularly in an environment today in 2020, when there aren't a lot of vehicles of size in the heavy duty class that are ready for market and ready for the same customers of ours to purchase, well, we better walk the talk. We have a 7,000 vehicle fleet of our own, lots of bucket trucks to run out and help with distribution maintenance or building new transmission lines. We might as well work with the very same vehicle manufacturers that we're trying to connect our commercial customers to develop, to invest in, to figure out how we electrify our own fleet so we can prove that it can be done. One effort we're doing. Another piece of getting to Pathway 2045 is electrifying buildings across the state of California. So again, walk the talk. I was pleased when I got to Edison to learn that 99% of our 1,300 buildings that we manage as part of our corporate real estate portfolio are fully electric at this point. So there's 1%. There's a little small tail there that we got to keep working at. But the good news is Edison feels like if we put our money where our mouth is, we walk the talk, we're going to do a lot to help with public adoption of these broader goals in Pathway 2045. Last thing I'll say is a big piece of 2045, of course, is decarbonizing the electricity we buy and provide to our customers. Pleased to tell you that SCE now delivers over 50% of our power that we deliver is carbon-free, and that's a really great position for us to be in, and we continue to do more work there. Barriers you mentioned, barriers are customer adoption. Barriers include unique California challenges, like we seem to be in a 12-month-a-year wildfire season, where we have to make sure that our equipment is not the cause of any catastrophic wildfires. And when there are catastrophic wildfires, regardless of the cause, that we're able to rally and get power restored and our assets protected, and frankly, our customers in better shape than before the fire started. So we have barriers that go well beyond COVID, which all of us are experiencing as well. You can imagine if you're a utility, the types of challenges that a global pandemic beset upon you, ability for crews to work together, sometimes in close proximity to fix the grid, to improve the grid, to get us on the path to supporting Pathway 2045. These are all challenges that we're dealing with today to meet that. But there's a lot of optimism among utility leaders in California, to include at Edison, and I have all the expectations that we'll meet or exceed even the interim goals that we've set out for ourselves in support of 2045.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. Audrey. Audrey is a board member with an organization called Gridworks, and also with a company called Sunrun. So Audrey Lee, I have a question for you. Your work is interesting and a little bit different than the previous panelists, in that you issues facing us, we look to transform our energy infrastructure. In Gridworks, you're focused on decarbonization of the grid to include distributed renewables and generation, vehicle to grid integration, even natural gas. And your work with Sunrun is kind of at the other end of the spectrum, if you will, aggregating residential and behind the meter energy systems to provide services back to the grid operators. Your fellow panelists are involved in utilities, generation at the multi-megawatt and gigawatt scale. So I'd like to ask you, do you have any thoughts about technical or policy measures that could enable a more effective interaction between customers with behind the meter systems and their utility providers? So by more effective, I mean at accelerating our reduction in carbon emissions. Your work seems to package all of this together in an interesting way.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I just want to clarify. So I left Sunrun in April, so I'm no longer with Sunrun. So my remarks are my own at this point. I am a board member of Gridworks, a nonprofit organization. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much. Very excited to be talking to the veteran community. I totally agree. We need to be very effective in accelerating this decarbonization. We need, a lot of the panelists come from the utility scale side, but we need both. We need utility scale solutions with renewables as well as customer sided solutions. I think you may have benefits of economies of scale when you have larger systems, but on the customer side, especially, Jim mentioned wildfires in California and other extreme weather, you do get resiliency when you deploy renewables and energy storage at customer homes and businesses. You get backup power and resiliency at those customer sites. I do come from the perspective, having worked in residential, commercial, and industrial customer sectors. I think it's very exciting, but it's been mentioned by our panelists that the dramatic cost declines in wind, solar, energy storage, electric vehicles, and also electrification of buildings, something that Jim mentioned, with heating, with heat pumps, induction cooking stovetops. And really, to reach our decarbonization goals, we need to decarbonize our electricity with things like utility scale wind, as Jeff talked about. But we also need to electrify our transportation and our buildings to reduce our use of fossil fuels like natural gas. So I think it's interesting, focused on California and some of the work and analysis, but with the election coming, a lot of the more progressive policies that you're seeing in states could become nationwide as well. So I think some of these states provide really good examples. And so in California, for example, an E3 study came out and said that it is economic, meaning customers save money when they are transitioning in their heating and cooling to a heat pump. Or if they have rooftop solar and they want to go to a heat pump, they can actually save money, or if they're building a new home. And then on the transportation side, I think a Brattle electric vehicle analysis said that, if we're going to get 20 million light duty electric vehicles by 2030, that's going to could require $75 to $125 billion of grid infrastructure costs, because we'll be dramatically increasing our electricity use on the grid. And I really like to take the customer perspective on this and to try to understand what is that residential customer or commercial small business facing. So if a customer adopts an electric vehicle, they could be increasing their electricity consumption by 40%. If they then electrify their heating with a heat pump, that's an additional 20%. And so this has dramatic implications for the grid, but also a lot of opportunity. We're seeing panel costs for solar become more efficient. And so roof space can be less of a limitation, and you can actually put more rooftop solar and serve that electricity. And of course, energy storage costs, battery costs are coming down as well. And I'll finally answer your question about what barriers, as we look to electrify our homes and our transportation, especially our homes and buildings, there's different jurisdictions across the country in terms of counties, in terms of permitting, all these authorities having jurisdiction on how do you turn a natural gas heating system to a heat pump, all the permitting. And so how do we make that a simpler process, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and digitize that, automate that more? And I think the bigger question is the regulatory structure to incentivize utilities. I'm really proud of the work that I had done at Sunrun over the past 3 years, partnering with utilities and trying to figure out how to integrate all this consumer demand for renewable energy, energy storage, and electrification. How do you integrate that into the utility business model? How do you partner with the utility so that we can move faster? These decarbonization goals are very ambitious, and so we all need to move quickly on climate change. I think what's interesting, coming from an engineering background, I have this belief that having more data and transparency and platforms where you can understand the grid better, that we can make smarter decisions, engage more stakeholders in the regulatory process. Perhaps we can be more efficient with our capital investment in the grid, and then be able to integrate both the utility-owned renewables that a lot of the panelists have talked about, but also the customer-sited energy resources, and help the utilities have a healthy business model, help customers save money on their electricity because of these technology advances. So I think really the biggest barrier is how do we change, how do we evolve and improve maybe the regulated monopoly model that we've had when the system was much more centralized, evolve that so all the stakeholders can benefit and we can make progress on these decarbonization goals.
That's a great answer. And if I could just segue on that just a little bit and continue this discussion along these lines. You talked about electrification, transportation, electric vehicles, induction cooktops, and so forth. All of these things increase the stress on the grid, and there's this tension between distributed resources and centralized grid. And I've had this debate with a number of people about the future direction. Do we continue to develop more distributed generation so that we get more efficient in the sense that the generation is closer to the load? You don't have these long central transmission systems with a lot of line losses and so forth. In fact, there was a proposal a decade ago to expand the 765 kV backbone, and I don't know that that's really gone very far. But how do you see this rolling out in the future? Do you see that this distributed generation model, these microgrids and so forth, are going to grow up to meet this increasing demand for electrification? Or do you think that there's going to be simply an expansion of the large transmission system we currently have in more centralized generation? So if you put your crystal ball on for a second, and do you have any thoughts about how that might roll out?
Yeah, and I spent a lot of my career actually doing energy policy analysis and modeling of energy markets and forecasts of energy systems. And I think it's a portfolio approach. You have to do both. You have to do both distributed and large utility scale. You have to build transmission networks. You have to change the way we think about at the distribution network level. I mean, if you look at the decarbonization goals, they're very ambitious, as I said, and we need to throw every tool in the toolbox at it. And I think there's just work to do in terms of integrating the two, right? You need all of that clean energy, but how do you expose the data, communicate to each other, coordinate with each other, so that we're doing this most efficiently and not wasting any of it? And that's in partnership with utilities, other stakeholders like ratepayer advocates and environmental advocates, and very importantly, industry to do this. I think the old model of a centralized controller of the grid, I just don't think works anymore. It needs to be more distributed, and we need to coordinate with each other so that we can utilize all these technologies that have come down in cost to make this grid.
I've read some places where they're talking about the grid, if you will, to the consumer becoming more like a cable provider. In other words, you pay a fee for access, and your bill isn't necessarily tied to how much of it you use, because you'll be using other sources besides the distribution and transmission system to get the energy you need. So I don't know if that's something that you've encountered or not.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. You could imagine a future where these costs continue to come down. A customer doesn't have one battery, but they have 5 batteries and they have a lot of solar. But they still want to be connected to the grid, and you want them to be connected to the grid because sometimes the grid wants their excess renewable energy. And so maybe that fee that you're mentioning is a fee to be connected to the grid and to have some of that power from the grid when necessary. But they also have the freedom to produce their own power as well. I think we need to be exploring those new models.
If I could stay on this topic just for a second about the future of the grid, the transformation of the grid. Are we going to stay centralized? Are we going to go more distributed? Is this going to be an either or? Is the world big enough for both to coexist peacefully? I'd like to turn that over, if I could, to Jeff, who has an interest in large-scale wind. One of the challenges is getting those electrons off of the wind turbines to where they're needed. And I know that there have been issues around high voltage transmission, rights of way, and so forth. So Jeff, could you just talk a few minutes about your vision of how this is going to play out in the future, or how you think the wind industry is dependent on this rolling out in the future?
Yeah, and so predicting the future in any profession is often an imperfect art, if you will. I agree with Audrey. You are going to see tremendous changes across every aspect of how Americans consume electricity. And we don't know yet where the sweet spots will be in terms of efficiency, low cost, reliability. We are the American Wind Energy Association, but many of our companies also own solar. They're investing in storage. We have the transmission companies as well, and the whole supply chain, the nuts and bolts manufacturers. And so we get, and we also have utility companies. We're members of OEA who have a wide mix of generation, including traditional and renewable sources. So we get to kind of see the discussion live and in living color as it's unfolding, and try to provide some answers to policymakers. Most people don't realize that the electric grid as it exists today is balkanized. Basically large chunks of areas in the United States that don't participate outside those borders by and large. A lot of efficiencies that we can't now benefit from are not going to be adopted unless we get those systems to work better together. There was a question from one of the viewers about a large backbone proposal that was made in 2008. The reality is it's been so hard to get the individual balancing authorities and all of the other folks that are responsible for the system to work together Not that they're bad people, it's just not in their interest. Rules aren't set up to benefit either them or their customers. We could really benefit from some national leadership about how those systems work better together through FERC, through our regional organizations, and even the governors, by the way, because I think what you'll see in the future is location decisions, businesses who want to access clean energy, and super empowered individuals who now look at where they want to live based on clean energy choices will drive the market in the future. And governors are paying attention, especially to the large commercial industrial users of energy. Think of Kraft Foods, think of Facebook, think of Google. In the future, you will see them decide to locate where they can get access to clean energy and then also talk about it as a company. And so we're going to need a balance of both, a backbone, if you will, a power cord that connects America's economy, call it the electric superhighway of the 21st century. But you're also going to see that two-way interaction at the local level that Audrey talked about.
Thank you. So Jason, with Dominion, how does your business model view the expansion of distributed generation and people drawing less power from the grid?
That's a tricky question.
Yeah, I know it is. Yeah.
I don't think it's an easy answer to that. We know it's out there. We know that the system is not built to transmit power back into the grid easily. It's just not built that way. And to rebuild the entire system is an astronomical cost. So it's relying on our partners elsewhere. The innovative technologies coming up to develop the right technology, come up with the right processes. You have all of these policies, at the regional level, at the national level, that we have to get through to kind of make these changes, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's a very complex question that I gave a very poor answer to, but I think we all want to get there one day to find the right balance, to make sure our customers are getting reliable power at the right price. Nobody wants to overpay for it, and to just do the right thing for our ratepayers. So it's trying to find the right balance, find the right technology, find the right way to implement that technology, and just set about it. And I know from Dominion's perspective, we are trying to quickly change. We can't be the old company we were. We have to be innovative. We have to embrace change as it comes along. We have to adapt to what our customers' needs and to what the government wants, and so there's just a lot of change going on. So we have to be nimble, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
So we're always looking for ways to do that.
Sure. But these things have to be done thoughtfully. They've got to be done rationally. They can't be done impulsively, because there's a lot at stake here. And so I appreciate the diligence that goes into the thinking that you're putting behind the program. So Jim, another utility, if you don't mind, I'd like to pose the same question to you in terms of how you see this interaction, if you will, between distributed generation and centralized generation. And from your own perspective, how does SoCal Edison see this playing out in the future?
Yeah, well, I have to tell you, it's an active topic. We at Edison have our own generation assets. We have, I think, the largest hydro renewable asset in the country in our Big Creek system up in the Sierra that was frankly built back in the late 1800s, if I remember properly. And the idea that we are just a customer of actually some of the co-panelists here and their competitors, flies in the face of we actually generate a fair amount of actually renewable energy ourselves. In addition, as we think about ways that we can respond to wildfire challenge, for example, the need to not necessarily run public safety, power shutoffs, PSPS as we call them, where it's unpredictable in some cases with our customers when they might actually, for safety reasons, not have their power available to them. We've actually entertained the idea of microgrids being a really good localized way to temporarily generate power that can help in those situations. So for us, it's a really complex ecosystem of centralized generation that we buy, got to be renewable more often than not going forward, of course. Distributed generation, both that we run and that we're thinking about popping up, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because of some of the exigent circumstances we find ourselves in. So I think one of the co-panelists said it really well. You got to do all. It's sort of a all of the above type of option to make sure that customers have what they need and that it's as renewable as possible. I think that's a challenge not only faced by us, but certainly our sister IOUs here in the state of California. And as I'm learning, it's pretty much a national challenge.
Very much so. Very much so. So I'd like to ask Barack, do you see applications for your technology supporting distributed generation, or is the scale at which your plants pencil out utility scale all the time?
So let me just say, our first commercial projects are anticipated to be 300 megawatts in scale, net electric, but the technology is scalable down to 10, 25, 50 megawatts net electric. So there's no inherent limitation for us to be able to do smaller dispatch. As far as DG is concerned, I do believe we are a perfect pairing for an increasingly DG world, because when you look at it, we want clean power to back up mostly wind and solar when they're not dispatching.
That's right.
The only clean power of any significance on the US grid right now, for the most part, is hydro and nuclear, neither of which like to ramp up or down at the rates that are going to be required. And this is why we defaulted to peaker plants, natural gas peaker plants. But when you get to that point, you are, dealing with efficiencies that still put out significant amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. So our technology operates like a peaker plant, captures all the CO2 associated with the combustion, because it is a single gas turbine. And like I said earlier, we are able to store electrons as protons, aka liquid oxygen, for future combustion. I did a detailed study where we looked at CalISO, middle of the day. We're storing solar energy as oxygen, as a battery that's that $5 to $10 a kilowatt hour. And in the evenings, aka 6 p.m., when there's a giant spike in power demand, we can ramp up instantly like a peaker plant. All the while, there's no fallout from CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. And a lot of people ask, like, when you operate like a peaker, you need certain power prices because your capacity factor is low. Well, funny enough, in our type of plant, we're able to basically undersize the thing that makes the oxygen to save capital costs, put it towards storage, which is actually lower cost than the generation, and control the cost of electricity that comes out of our unit. So yes, I think we are the seam between wind and solar and nuclear and hydro.
Yeah, at that scale, that makes a lot of sense. Do you see your primary business as being peaker plants or baseload plants?
Both. Realistically, I think it really depends on where you are. If you're in the eastern side of the United States, more baseload scale, simply because there are not a whole lot of clean options. And you got to deal with the CO2 in a way that's cost effective from an economy of scale. If you're in the West, probably operating at smaller scale, more like peakers. As has already been said, it's going to be DG and centralized. It really is a function of the natural resources you have available to you in your area.
Yeah. When you get down to the level of 10 megawatts, I could see you being even a behind the meter industrial microgrid backbone, if you will, for a military base or a large industrial facility. I mean, that's
it's funny that you say that. That's exactly what we're exploring right now.
Okay. we should talk to some folks in DoD.
Yep.
Okay. One last question that has come up. I'd like to ask each of the panelists if you could just see whether you have any thought about where this may be going in the future, and that's the superconducting backbone. We've got a transmission line in New York, Long Island at this point. There are a few of them around the world, including in Germany. So is that something you see as an evolving value-added technology for the U.S. as the grid evolves? I can start with you, Brock. You're already here.
Yeah. Yes and no. The reason I say yes and no is it really depends on economies of scale, because you don't go build a highway way out in the middle of nowhere with nobody to ever use it. So I believe it has to be clean, it has to be cheap. That's the way you get everybody to buy in, regardless of political affiliation, commercial, residential. If it's fair price, it's easier to sell clean. I think superconducting backbones from a technical perspective are kind of a no-brainer. They're logical. As an engineer, I see it as an elegant solution. But from a commercial perspective, you have to really start to look at the details of, if you're going through a 500-mile expanse of the United States where it's not being used and it has to be carried by the local taxpayers, well, that doesn't really make sense.
Right.
So this is where, the proposal of energy for residential consumption being something more like, a Comcast bill or whoever your cable utility happens to be, starts to make more sense when you start integrating this type of technology, because you really do need to distribute the costs across larger population in order to make it fair to consumers. So technically, I think it's viable. Economically, socially, it's really going to be the devil's in the details. It's really going to come down to how you distribute the costs.
Yeah. There are probably some useful use cases in the U.S. or some appropriate use cases, but certainly not ubiquitous. But speaking of use cases, Jim, there may be some in your backyard.
Might be. I really like Brock's comment around economies of scale. And when you're a utility, at least in our state, you have to put that right square back in the regulatory environment. So what our citizens in California care about right now is climate change. So Brock said it's got to be cheap and it's got to be clean. I think it also has to show how it, more than other transmission setups, is going to further enhance our GHG goals. You come up with a business case there, that's going to get a lot of attention here in the state of California, I can tell you. But I would love to know if we've actually tried something like that. I think about the grid across the country is, somewhat regionalized, somewhat based on natural features that beget, whether you've got hydro coming from Hoover Dam or you've got, the sun available to you for solar arrays, and then how that actually economically transmits. So maybe one idea, and it's probably been put in practice with the superconducting line out east, is starting to think about that in a bit of a regional way where it might make sense, economies of scale, and then go beyond that.
Okay. Yeah, maybe a few West Coast situations, but probably East Coast has more large loads that are in proximity that may make this pencil out better. But you're right about the carbon aspect. If you start pricing that in, that may change the economics of some of the ideas. I'd like to pivot. We only have a few minutes left here, and I know there's some other topics I'd like to get to here. We generally think, and this is going to be a complete pivot, we generally think of populations without energy access as being in sub-Saharan Africa and rural Asia and places like that. But we've got a lot of rural areas in the US as well that don't have the kind of energy services that most of us have become accustomed to. And I'm just wondering, and perhaps Audrey is the best maybe to take this one on. Do you have any thoughts about how do we get rural communities, poor communities connected to clean energy sources, clean energy, modern sources?
Yeah, on the distributed side, at Sunrun, I had lots of conversations with co-ops, which are predominantly in rural areas, and the feedback I got is there's a lot of interest from their customers to put on rooftop solar and potentially storage, especially in areas where there are natural disaster risks for backup power with that battery. But I think it's a little bit newer in terms of the business model for a co-op to adopt rooftop solar and batteries, although some are leading that. So I definitely think that's an interesting area where, especially where the co-op, I think in general, is very directly in touch with their customers, right? Their customers are their members. And so they're very responsive to their customer demand. And so as you've seen the costs come down and you've seen the benefits of rooftop solar and batteries and other electrification, customers are demanding this. So I think you'll see that very soon. I was reading an article on Holy Cross Energy and what they're doing with rooftop solar and batteries and resiliency. Very interesting. And I think some of that work actually came out of NREL. Very interesting work there. So I don't think there's anything about rural that limits. I think it's interesting to think about rural versus urban. And in terms of, I think, as Brock mentioned, what is the right resource solution for the region that you're in? In urban areas, it is difficult to build a transmission line through a heavily populated area. When I was at the California Public Utilities Commission, I worked on the Tehachapi line and the first 500 kV is an Edison project, 500 kV underground transmission line through Chino Hills, which is very controversial with the residents who didn't want a large transmission line going through their, next to their backyards on an easement. And so there are different solutions for urban areas. For example, when the San Onofre nuclear generating station closed in SC and SDG&E territory, the challenge with that was the gap of you needed to replace that capacity that was supplied by nuclear, but it was an urban area. You couldn't just bring transmission lines through LA from solar in the desert. You had to think about resources that you could deploy within the urban area, like rooftop solar and batteries, to fulfill that capacity. So it is very much, depends upon the need. There was if I may just take the opportunity to answer one of the questions in the Q&A box about transmission and distribution losses. I think that is that's one of the benefits of having a distributed, customer-sided resources, is that you don't have those losses, right? You're producing power where it's being used, and there are efficiencies associated with that. And there's also economies of scale in doing rooftop solar and batteries, in that there's a high customer acquisition cost. There's a high truck roll cost just to get a truck out to a customer to install. But every marginal panel that you put on, especially as customers use more electricity with electric vehicles and heat pumps, is just the cost of the panel, because you've already paid for that customer acquisition cost. You've already sent the truck out to the home to install the panel. And so those marginal incremental costs are actually quite competitive with utility scale solar. So I think we can kind of rethink, if we do overbuild on rooftop solar, you can get some of those cost efficiencies that utility scale solar has as well.
I'd just like to briefly follow up on a couple of comments you made. When I hear putting that kind of density in urban areas, and I hear putting long transmission lines underground, I cringe when I think about the SF6 switchgear that may have to support that. Is that an issue that you?
Others are much more expert at this than me. But I remember talking to one transmission equipment provider, that there are actually alternatives if the regulations are in place. So no expert, but it sounded to me from this person that at a cocktail hour that if you were serious about SF6 and you put in the regulations to require the transmission builders to deploy new technology that would prevent release of SF6, very harmful greenhouse gas, that you could, there are technology solutions to that. We just haven't paid attention and regulated that. That's
okay.
What I learned in a cocktail hour. So I'd love for
thank you.
Appreciate
that. Okay, very good. Let's see. So Jason, this business about getting the power from the large wind turbines that are going to be offshore back to where they're used and then distributed through the state. Other than building the transmission lines from the actual wind plants themselves to the shore, is there any other infrastructure that Dominion needs to support those? Any additional transmission rights of ways and that sort of thing? Because I know in certain parts of Virginia that becomes a public debate.
Yes. The answer is yes. There's more to it than just bringing the transmission line to shore. You've got to get from that, you do horizontal drilling to bring it to the shore. And then from that point on, you've got to get to a substation somewhere. So a part of that is the application process with with PJM, the regional operator out here. And they put together a study. They'll actually go to the transmission organization and put together a feasibility study to understand what the right path is. They'll have to come up with alternatives. There'll be a whole public review. It is not easy. It's going to take years to do. It's going to take significant capital investment to do so, because there has to be grid improvements to do so. Really, when you think about it, it's 2.6 gigawatts hanging out at the end of our system. So it's going to create some stability challenges as well to the grid. So we're working through all of that. It's challenging, and we're going to see along the East Coast. I mean, we have this huge demand for wind power. New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maryland, they've all passed legislation to bring in wind power. But we have to connect it to the grid somehow, and the system's not built to do that right now. There's going to be some challenges. So.
Okay. Okay. I presume this is mostly around the Hamptons Road area that,
For
This is-
for our commercial wind farm, yes, it's
Yeah.
around Hampton areas,
Yeah.
coming in near Virginia Beach. So we're
Right,
working
yeah.
closely with them. They're very excited about it. And,
Yeah. already a dense area,
Yes.
So let's see. We have 4 minutes left, perhaps time for a quick round question. I guess I would say the question I would ask is project yourself 5 years from now and 10 years from now, and tell me where you would like your program to be. So we'll start with the top of the dance card, and we'll let Brock go first.
5 years from now, I would like it just to be a known commodity that NetPower is your clean natural gas technology. 10 years from now, I would like us to have made several gigatons of dent in emissions that otherwise would have gone up into the atmosphere from conventional fossil fuels. So, I mean, I think that's really our mission, is to address climate change over the next 30 years and do it in a way that's economically viable, pro-business, but doesn't give up anything when it comes to actually achieving those climate goals. So that's it.
Thank you. Jason.
Let's see. 5 years from now, I'd really like to see technology in energy storage to improve. That'll help the entire industry. Some of these challenges that we have with renewable energy. 10 years from now, I think that offshore wind and solar is going to be enormous. I think it's going to be 10 times more than what we have today. I'm excited about that. I'd like to say, from a veteran's perspective, I think that having veterans come from the service into utilities or supporting industries is a powerful tool because of the sense of service from veterans, the fact that they can have a mission-oriented type work environment. I think there's be a lot of benefit for veterans to do so. So there's opportunities out there, and I suggest for them to go out and do as much as they can to get into the business.
Thank you. Let's see. Jeff. No, I'm very,
Thank you, Tom, thank you, Tom, for the opportunity, and to the fellow panelists. 5 to 10 years from now, what we already know is what's built in America, over 100 gigawatts of wind already in the ground, is scheduled to double. Real question is, will it triple or quadruple? And I like to, speak directly to the veterans. Veterans understand better than anyone the connection between our economy, energy, and national security. Those of us that deployed to the Middle East to largely protect America's energy access realize that some of those policies don't work well together and are very expensive. And so in the future, I think you'll see veterans raise their voices about a clean electricity grid. Access to energy that's American made is as important to them as national security and economic success. And I look forward to that future.
thank you. Audrey, could I go to you next?
Yeah, of course. Great question. I would love in 5 years if it was just super simple for customers to adopt rooftop solar, batteries for backup, and grid management, as well as heat pumps for electrification. Make it a simple process that takes less than a week instead of the 2 months it takes to get permitting and interconnection. And if that happens, then we can really put the workforce to work in transforming our buildings to be cleaner and help us with our recovery in terms of the COVID crisis, including veteran community, put more people to work to transform our infrastructure.
This sounds more like a PUC to PUC fight rather than a legislative proposal.
I think it's everything. It's setting ambitious goals at the national and state levels,
Okay.
PUCs, but also your local county permitting office, and how you upgrade your changing electrical codes.
Yes.
And just as an example, I wanted to get a heat pump, and I was told by my electrician I needed to spend $40,000 to upgrade my service to 400 amps.
Oh,
when
geez.
I don't have everything on my house on at the same time. We can use digital technologies to have smarter controls of the appliances and usage in the home. So there's a lot of opportunity for technology in the home.
Okay, thank you. And then Jim.
We know we have a 25-year plan to Pathway 2045.
That's
So 5 to 10, we need to be hitting each of those interim goals around GHG reduction and, of course, electrification of the transportation and building sector. So we'll do that, hopefully exceed that. But I also hope for no catastrophic wildfires here in California for sure over that same time period. And for Edison, we place 40% of our $5 billion a year in third-party spend with certified diverse businesses, a big chunk of it with certified disabled veteran businesses. I'd like to see us grow that above its current percentage in spend. And so we're on the hunt. We're on the hunt for California-based service disabled veteran-owned busises to help us on this journey for the next 25 years.
That's good. That's music to our ears. Thank you. All right. I have kept you 1 minute past our closing time. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council production team that was behind making all of this work so smoothly. And I'd like to thank you in the audience for being with us today. If you want to share the stream with a colleague, there's a cached replay that's available on the conference website or the Atlantic Council YouTube channel. And coming up next in our program, to make sure you tune in right after this, there's an interactive networking feature for veteran leaders working for the Department of Energy and for the national laboratories. So you won't want to miss that. At 8 p.m. Eastern, don't miss out on the last film screening of The Current Revolution, hosted by the American Resilience Project, with special commentary from the director. And thanks again. We look forward to seeing you at another Veterans Energy event. So thank you all very much.